Okay, we are take two. My sweaty hands got in the way and muted me, but we are going to try this again. I'll start from the beginning. Okay, so this presentation is about the LA Aqueduct. And we've talked about Owens Valley before and Chinatown. But I thought this documentary gave a really fresh perspective on tribal perspectives of the aqueduct, and we talked about that with Manzanar Diverted as well, and that was fantastic, but this has more of a Tongva voice in it. I wanted to just share the whole documentary with you on YouTube, but after trying to share Chinatown on Zoom, and that failed epically, I'm not going to take that risk again. So I thought we would talk about it here, and I'll share, I did a little more research into some of the things they talked about, and then strongly recommend that everyone goes and watches the Aqueduct Between Us on YouTube. It's a 5-part series. You can watch it in little breaks, or you can watch the whole thing. It's only 40 minutes, so I would just watch the whole thing if you can. And it's free. It's right there on YouTube, and it's just a really fascinating, fresh take from members of the Tongva and Paiute tribes who are water activists and historians talking about the LA Aqueduct situation. So it's a really fresh perspective. Okay, so we're going to start all the way back in the beginning with who the Tongva and Paiute people were. So the Tongva were the original inhabitants of the LA River Basin. So where modern day LA County is, that's where the Tongva people lived, and they had the word Pa'ar for water, and then Paya is the word for water from the Paiute people, and they were living in what is modern day Owens Valley. Pre-contamination is how they phrased it. So before being introduced to the Spanish, and when we say contamination, a lot of diseases were brought over by settlers. So pre-contamination, the Tongva were probably the largest tribe in Southern California. And they've said that by the time the Spanish got here to Southern California, they had already been to a lot of what they would call New Worlds, or a lot of North and South American regions, and they knew what they were doing. They were a well-oiled machine, and when they got there, they had basically decided that the Tongva people had to die. The Catholics came to San Diego in 1542, and then the missions began in 1771. And people were killed immediately. Statues and relics of their gods were thrown in the trash. Languages were forbidden, and their baskets were burned. The Paiute people, faced a lot of horrors, and they felt, most of them felt like they had to assimilate to be able to survive. So they were forced into labor, and they were forced to repurpose the water that they had always been using for the needs of the Spanish and for the settlers' purposes. So some of them had made conscious decisions that, hey, we are seeing our culture fall apart, but if we don't assimilate, we're going to die altogether. And they felt like they had no other choice but to go along with what the settlers were doing. The Spanish buildings were built by indigenous slaves, and, historically, they never really get credit for their work. A lot of the mission buildings that are still preserved around the West are, most of those were built by enslaved indigenous people. Then Mexicans came later, and they kicked out the Spanish settlers, but the Tongva were still under their rule. And then after Mexicans were no longer controlling the area, the United States started coming in, and they would begin with contracting treaties with the Tongva people for different pieces of land that they would govern. In the 1860s, the gold rush brought many new people who disrupted the land, and they settled around the Sierras. Those settlers then brought cattle with them, which trampled over everything, really. A lot of the crops that indigenous people were growing, a lot of the wild plants and food that Paiute people relied on, the cattle just stepped all over it, or they ate it. And then the settlers put up fences and said, well, this is my land, you can't access it anymore. despite having lived here for thousands of years. And then the settlers started moving water. So it began way before LADWP. The moving of the water began really with the settlers to the area. And a Paiute member was quoted as saying, "The way to get rid of native people was always to destroy their food supply," and that's exactly what they did. That has been kind of their pattern all along. During the Owens Valley Indian War between 1861 and 1866, ranchers who had the support of the US military and the Paiutes tried to wipe each other out. Paiute homes and their stores of food were destroyed. Paiute fought back with bows and arrows, and they had some guns too, but in the severe winter of 1861, a Paiute man was hunting for food. He wanted to bring back something to his family, and he found a lost cow, and he thought, well, it's lost. It's probably never going to go back to the rancher that had it originally. He slaughtered it, and while he was butchering it, the ranchers who were looking for the cow, they came and they saw him butchering it, and they killed this man. And then that began a bunch of skirmishes. But in 1863, 35 Paiute people were chased into Owens Lake by 10 settlers and 20 soldiers, and they were either shot or drowned on that day. After that massacre, the Paiute people were marched by the US military to San Sebastian, which is also known as Fort Tejon. And then that became a real shared side of pain for both of the Tongva and the Paiute people, because it was the first Indian reservation where the Tongva were relocated. And they just happened to be relocated in July, which of course we know is the hottest month around here. And it was essentially another Trail of Tears, but not really given as much attention to it in history when we look at other death marches like this. That area had 50,000 acres, but no game, so no wild game, nothing that they could hunt. There was no water at this area, and the land was really not meant for agricultural purposes. White squatters began to invade that land anyway, despite not having much. So by the mid-1860s, the tribes just abandoned it. In 1866, a lot of the Paiute who had abandoned that area moved back to the land they've been living in for thousands of years in the Owens Valley. And some of them were able to stay and work there and become part of the agricultural economy that the settlers had started. But the Dawes Act of 1887 started kind of an institutional practice of allotment, which was dividing up the tribal land into little personal tracts. So small space of land for you, for this family, which is pretty different from the communal life that a lot of tribes had already been living in. So that was one piece of kind of the demise of the area. And then in 1900, the Bureau of Indian Affairs established schools, Americanized schools, teaching American values and religious values. And nearly every Owens Valley Paiute child went to those schools. In 1932, the government then revoked the reservation of land. They revoked 67,000 acres of land for the Owens Valley Paiute and said, you know what, you can't live here after all. In the 1930s, the city of LA did a series of reports called the Indian Problem, which was a phrase that had been floating around since the 1800s. And they started documenting the living conditions of the tribes. And they said things like, some are living in dugouts or crudely conducted shacks that are detrimental to their health and a disgrace to American ideals. A lot of this language was used to try to create further division between settlers or I guess at that point they would call themselves Californians, and tribes, and try to make things that much more difficult and complicated between them. The commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA, John Collier at the time, was aware of the negative effects of the Dawes Act and how it was impacting the tribes. In his tenure at the Indian Defense Association in the 1920s, the Institute for Government Research released the Merriam Report, which detailed the poor condition of tribal economies and the utter destitution in the Indian country after these effects. According to the report, the average national per capita income in 1920 for an average American was $1,350, while the average Native American made only $100 per year. Their Marion report said that the Indian policy in the United States was creating this poverty. The feds didn't agree with the city of LA. So the city of LA wanted the tribes to be further removed from the land, but the feds didn't agree at that point. And they said they would give back the land to the tribes and then just deal with the issue of water later. So they said, we've got land, you can have land. The water, in terms of finding water for the Paiute people, well, we'll figure that out later. And that issue never did get resolved. 100-something years later, it's still not an issue that was ever resolved. The Big Pine Paiute Reservation sits on 279 acres, but that groundwater underneath is still owned by Los Angeles. Alan Baycock from the Paiute Big Pine Tribal Water Program, he's their coordinator, said the people who were here before us, long before us, have never been treated as friends. They have been treated as enemies and dealt with more harshly than any other enemy in any of this country's wars. After all of our major wars, we signed peace treaties and lived by those treaties. After World War II, when we made peace with Germany, we then did everything we possibly could to rebuild Germany. But no Native American tribe has ever been treated as well as we treated Germans after World War II. Really something to think about. So the aqueduct. In the 1902 annual report, William Mulholland, who at the time was the chief engineer of the LA Aqueduct, stated, with a closely estimated population of 85,000, we reached the astounding consumption of over 26 million gallons of water per day, or about 306 gallons per capita. By the application of a few hundred meters, the consumption was cut down nearly 3 million gallons per day. In that same year, he estimated that water metering could reduce per capita consumption to 150 gallons per day. So LA was one of the first cities doing that. And as Karen mentioned, Sacramento hasn't caught up until the last year on water metering. 2022 is when Sacramento finally finished their water metering. By 1903, per capita consumption was actually reduced to 200 gallons per day from the previous high of 306. In the same period, however, Los Angeles had grown to a population of then 175,000. So that's more than double. Mulholland began efforts to determine what Los Angeles' actual needs would be. He used a per capita demand of 150 gallons per day and estimated that population growth based on those previous 10 years. He foresaw that the city would have maybe 390,000 people using more than 58 million gallons per day by 1925. So the required volume was more than double the minimum flow of the Los Angeles River, and it just wouldn't be enough. Even the maximum recorded flow would fall 10% short of meeting the city's needs. Only later would he learn that the actual growth of LA during that 20-year period would still exceed his estimate by more than 4 times. So just to compare, he said that they were at 306 gallons per person was their high, and he was hoping to get it down to 150 gallons per person. And the result from the metering was 200 gallons per person. To compare to today, in 2022, Riverside County's average was 137 gallons per day. In LA, it was 111 gallons per day, and in San Francisco, 40 gallons per day. But I have heard numbers as low as 42 gallons per day for lower income users in the LA area. So quite a big difference from then and now with our modern conservation techniques. In 1904, Mayor Fred Eaton, engineer J.B. Lippincott, and Mulholland toured the Owens Valley, and they decided to send that water to LA. They began purchasing land in the Owens Valley, and they used bonds to purchase it in 1905, and they filed for water rights for the city of Los Angeles. Municipal crews began work on a 233-mile aqueduct capable of delivering 4 times more water than the city required at the time. Construction began in 1908, and then in 1912, new land was set aside for the tribes by President Taft. So 67,000 acres set aside so that LA could finish their aqueducts and access that water. The LA Aqueduct was completed in 1913 with this firm water supply, allowing the city to grow. So I just wanted to point out in my research that on the LADWP's page about the LA Aqueduct, there was no mention at all of any of the Paiute people or what they went through. It doesn't talk about anything related to that. However, it does talk about the world records that this aqueduct set, and how much blasting powder they used. And I thought that this quote was particularly telling of their sentiment and their attitude about the situation. And they said, with the first surge of water, the excitement and anticipation of the crowds reached a fever pitch. The people rushed up to the edge of the cascade, wild with delight to be closer to the clear mountain water. For a quarter of an hour, they gazed on the foaming white water with fascination and wonder. At last, the crowd quieted down and the dedication ceremony continued. The next order of business was the presentation of the aqueduct to the city. Mulholland stood again to speak and faced Mayor Henry Rose and the people assembled before him. Mulholland made one of the most eloquent and effective addresses of the day, and also the shortest. There it is, take it, he said. And I think that attitude of taking it is really kind of pretty quintessential for them. So by the 1920s, LA was as populous as San Francisco. So to protect their water rights, LA began purchasing land and accompanying water rights in the Owens Valley and converting cropland to a less water-intensive use, which was cattle grazing at the time. It was, one of their ways to conserve. Irrigated acreage in the valley dropped from about 75,000 acres in 1920 to 23,000 acres in 1940. And as early as 1924, area ranchers and businessmen feared for the valley's agricultural future. And then that's when they started their water wars that we talked about with Chinatown and dynamiting the aqueduct at least 17 times in an attempt to stop the water flowing, which we know was never really that successful. To continue on Mulholland's legacy, I thought I'd be remiss not to mention St. Francis Dam, which I believe we've talked about before, but if not, in 1928, only a few years after that, William Mulholland left the LADWP as he was shaken by the tragedy of the St. Francis Dam, which is 40 miles north of Los Angeles. March 12th of that year, Mulholland inspected the new dam, the construction of which he had supervised, said everything was great, and then only hours later it collapsed and it killed 450 people in the ensuing flood. So he accepted full responsibility and resigned. I've read accounts that he never forgave himself, that he really struggled with that the rest of his life and died maybe a decade after that. So it took several decades after the water was stolen for the aqueduct. It took several decades after the aqueduct was built for the region to dry up completely. And there might have been a few intermittent wet seasons, but with all that water being exported down to LA, it was only a matter of time. So when the pollution did begin to blow, however, Owens Lake earned the notorious reputation. It became the largest human-caused source of dangerous PM10 or particulate matter size 10 emissions in the entire country. It hit the tribal communities living on the Paiute reservation particularly hard. And member Bancroft said, that's why we all have breathing problems. And he was diagnosed with asthma later in life. They recall dust storms so severe that they reminded them of smoking from a bad wildfire. It wasn't a wildfire, it was a dust storm. We're in this narrow, deep valley, so it takes the air a long time to clear up around here. When something like that happens, we're stuck breathing the air for a long time. It goes up really quickly. The valley is filled brown from rim to rim. You can taste the salt in your throat, in your mouth, and in your nose. People with breathing problems start showing up at our local ER room in our little small town hospital. There hasn't been a comprehensive study that documented the fallout of Owens Lake dust on surrounding communities, but in the late 1980s, the LA Times reported bloody noses, rising cases of diseases like emphysema, and people who required supplemental oxygen after years of breathing the air around Owens Lake. The public health consequences of dust pollution are well understood. Fine particulate matter can embed deep in the lungs and then move into the bloodstream and really take a toll on the heart and the brain. Chris Hohag happens to be a Sierra Club staff member, but in this capacity, he's also a member of the Bishop Paiute tribe, and in that capacity, he said, every single environmental issue in the Owens Valley is related to the LADWP water grab. Owens Lake was drained in under a decade, soil dried out, so it's lighter, and now it's polluting the air. There's arsenic and cadmium in the soil, being breathed in by the locals, making them sick. LADWP should be held responsible for the illnesses that have begun since the water was taken. So I thought that I would share some quotes from members of the tribes directly so we can hear from their voice. I'm going to ask Karen if you could unmute yourself and you would like to read what you see on this page.
Okay. Today, I feel like LADWP occupies our land. Alan Babcock, Paiute Big Pine Tribal Water Program Coordinator. LADWP's goal is for everyone to leave so they can use the land solely for water for the city of LA. Terry Red Owl, Owens Valley Indian Water Commission Executive Director. There hasn't been a real meaningful discussion in recent years with LADWP about how they can help remedy the situation that they have caused. They've said that they have a moral obligation to help us, but they have taken as much as they can, as fast as they can, in case, God forbid, they lose it. Chris Hohag, Bishop Paiute. We live in different worlds, but the water connects us. Tongva and Paiute tribes are both disenfranchised. The 4 sacred rivers today are just cement pathways. Kelly Caballero, Tongva activist. There's a lack of knowledge and respect for Tongva people. People know about us, but don't do anything to show respect. They don't fight for us. We might get park and street names, but no reparations. Tongva stories aren't told from the indigenous perspective. We don't have a relationship with the US government. We'd have more land back and more relationships with sacred sites. L. Frank, Tongva activist. They want to get rid of us because they think we want something, so they're in no hurry to help us out. By us being extinct, there's no hurry to recognize us. When we are recognized for our work, they don't recognize our identities with it. And then finally, Julia Boganet, activist, I feel invisible.
Oh, chills.
Yeah.
Karen, you were so great. If you could read these recommendations from members of the tribes.
Okay, let's see. Let's see, am I where I need to be? We need the real history of water in the LA curriculums. Boy, is that true. Kelly Caballero, Tongva activist. Angelinos can be better allies by standing with us, but not step in front of or speak for us. Let our words be heard beyond opening events. Listen to what we say and help move forward. Spread the word to non-Indigenous people. Include the native voices of the local area. Angelinos are a key part of the struggle because they have power. They can vote. They vote for elected officials. Keep them up to date. If you hear about something in the Owens Valley, tell your elected official. And that quotes from Kathy Jefferson, Lone Pine Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Stay informed and pass along information. Chris Hohag, Bishop Paiute. Alan Babcock, Paiute Big Pine Tribal Water Program Coordinator. LA is so far removed that by the time Angelinos hear about something happening up here, it's a disaster, but it doesn't have to be. LA can be self-sufficient for water. Love the world, live more simply, find balance, learn about Mother Earth, watch the sunset and rise, and see how precious it is. Haya is life. Well, if we listened to that, we'd be a lot better off.
Right? Thank you, Karen. So here are some sources, and I strongly recommend everyone checks out the Aqueduct Between Us on YouTube. And it's got beautiful visuals as well. But that brings us to the end. If anyone has some thoughts they want to share, questions, comments, thoughts.
You know what it brings up for me is the desperate need to teach Indigenous history in schools. And to do that either by bringing in speakers or in respectful consultation with speakers reviewing curriculum before it's taught.
I love that. Yes, in schools, and then on the inspection tours, like we were talking about a couple weeks ago, for policymakers, for board members of water agencies to hear directly from members of the tribes would just be so incredibly impactful, and it's really missing.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Many years ago, I taught anthropology in LA, and back then there wasn't as much activism from the tribes in the LA area, but the people I had contact with, I used 10 weeks of my 20-week class. They were kind enough to come in and teach. So students learned about the Indian schools where children were grabbed and placed in these schools to forbid their language and forbid their cultural heritage. And they learned about the massacre at Wounded Knee from a 90-year-old woman who'd survived it. They thought she was dead because she was covered in her parents' blood. And it was just an incredibly powerful, I did that for like 5 years, the last 5 years I lived in LA. And students were brought to tears. They'd never heard any of it. They had no idea. And now there's so many more activists, and there's so many of them in tribal cultures in California. And it really needs to be part of the curriculum, as well as those tribal representatives being able to speak with all of the water districts, so that people might start to understand, and if they have a conscience, might start to act.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's bringing to mind, we typically talk about environmental things, but I saw recently that there's a fight now because the Indian Child Welfare Act, I think is what it's called, is up for review, and some Christian foster parents are fighting it and saying, no, let us take your children away from your culture and your reservations and everything you've ever known. And, we should be able to adopt whoever we want.
And it's been heard, we don't know the verdict, at the Supreme Court. It's being represented by an incredibly wealthy law firm that represents big oil. And I donate every year, it's my reparations, to something called the Lakota People's Law Project. And they have done webinars on it, because what it looks like is if they can break down the protections that the Child Welfare Act, that act provided to keep Indigenous children in their tribe, so that they lose parents, they're placed with another family member or a tribal member, that if they lose on that, it opens the door to lose the rest of tribal rights, which will open reservations to oil and gas with no consult at all with the tribes. It's terrifying. It's an attempt to open up a much bigger thing and undo all the gains that tribes have made. And the people in Lakota law were among the organizers of Standing Rock. So they're very savvy about what's going on. Plus, a couple of them are attorneys with specialties in tribal law. And they're very, very worried about it.
Wow, that makes me sick to my stomach.
Yeah, me too.
The lengths that oil companies will go.
Anything. When you do what they're doing to EJ communities and know the cancer rates, including of children in those communities.
Any other thoughts, questions, comments? Haley, you're unmuted.
Yes. Yeah. Oh. Yes. Yeah. I think it was sad when I read about it. What's going on? I think the trouble is progressives are not blameless because they have just let the white lead the narrative on Supreme Court justice for years. They made an issue of it in 2012 when the court unleashed the Citizen United, and they did make an issue in 2016 when the Supreme Court majority of the conservative judge struck down the voting rights of 1965, and they weren't taken seriously about the control of the Senate in 2016, in which the Republicans retained the Senate. And as a result, we got 3 conservative judges. And you saw what they did to Roe versus Wade. Now they're doing it to the Indian Child Resource Center.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Some good news on the Supreme Court justice front. So many of them have been caught being corrupt in the last few months that now there's being, I think, a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on that because, we've got Clarence Thomas and then,
Neil Gorsuch.
well, yeah, him. And then there was one more too.
John Roberts.
Yes. All 3 of them and their wives have been caught doing corrupt things lately.
Incredibly mind-bogglingly corrupt stuff. And it's so blatant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then in a different vein, AOC and Matt Gaetz are actually working together to introduce a bill saying no active member of Congress can have stock in anything at all. So they would have to be completely divested of stocks within 90 days. It's a strange combination of people, but I'm here for it. I hope that works out for them.
You look at it, the court is just so corrupt, and these are the people, and so extremist, and these are the people making laws that impact all of us. And they're working for wealthy right-wing fanatics.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the people they represent.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, comments, questions? Okay, folks, I'm going to stop the recording.